Hello all, James and ListMania Wrestling here. Now, originally, we were going to do a mini piece on who invented the RKO, aka the Diamond Cutter, aka the Ace Crusher, the three-quarter facelock net breaker for all you nerds out there, if you want to be pedantic like I like to be. It was actually looking into the Ace Crusher that made me realise that Johnny Ace, while he's generally credited with inventing the cutter, it turns out it wasn't him. It was actually Barry Windham who came up with it, and then he gave it to Johnny to try out. Johnny also kinda invented what we know to be the stunner as well. He's not the answer to the question, by the way, but we'll get to that in a second. Here's the first video we think to be in existence of a cutter, but it ends up almost looking like a stunner as well. Instead of lying flat on his back, the future endeavoured master of the corporate NDA sits down instead of taking a flat back bump, as is the norm for a stunner. What makes it a cutter, though, is Ace's opponent, Ishikawa, taking a front bump instead of dropping down to his knees. So on that basis, and also the fact that he would further develop the cutter by dropping to his back in future iterations of the move, Johnny Ace is credited with creating the cutter, not the stunner. So, who created the stunner? Well, it wasn't Stone Cold Steve Austin, as I'm sure you can guess by now, otherwise everyone would just say, well, Stone Cold Steve Austin invented it, and that would be that. And it certainly wasn't Disco Inferno, or The Disciple, or Kevin Owens, or John Cena, or anybody else who has since gone on to use the move, or variations thereof, after Steve Austin popularised it. Quite frankly, all of wrestling should have retired the stunner to pay homage to Austin, and to not embarrass themselves by taking a move that is way too synonymous with one person for themselves. I kind of felt the same way about the Mandible Claw when The Fiend started using it, but that's just me personally. As for who was actually directly doing the stunner before Steve Austin, well, that's an easy one. Mikey Whipwreck in ECW was doing the Whippersnapper, aka the stunner, and two different versions of it, in fact. Sometimes he would do a regular stunner, sans setup kick to the gut, and other times he would perform the stunner from the second or top rope. That high-flying variation, Mikey did invent, no doubt about it. In fact, Whipwreck also invented the ridiculous third version of the stunner, a whippersnapper through a table. So considering that going through a table couldn't possibly add any more stank to the move, other than just make the whole process more cumbersome, seemed very much overkill to me. It did, however, if we are talking strictly kayfabe here, see Mikey's backside go through the table first, in theory giving himself a sore arse on the way down, with no added damage to his intended victim. Now, Mikey, who we have established did not invent the stunner, actually told me the story personally of who he got the stunner from, and the answer might surprise you.
I got the stunner from Jimmy Garvin. He was gone from WCW for a while, and then he came back on a random pay-per-view, I think against Johnny B. Bad, and he did a move to Johnny B. Bad, the stunner, and he called it the 911. So I started using it. I said, fuck, I'm going to start using it. Well, Steve started using the stunner at a suggestion from Michael Hayes. So either way you look at this, the stunner, the whippersnapper, can all be credited to the Freebirds.
And that is exactly where Mikey absolutely got the move from. It's not a stunner-esque kind of move, it's a stunner. Even though there's no familiar setup kick to the gut present, it is absolutely a stunner. And in fact, the crowd doesn't even particularly react to what would briefly be termed the 911 either. Now, for those unaware as to just why Jimmy Garvin was in WCW in 1994 after he'd basically retired 18 months earlier, Bill Watts in 1992 had just become the company's executive vice president, or whatever title they were going with that week, and budget cuts became the order of the day. The Freebirds were split up, and Jimmy was then booked as a glorified jobber before he left WCW. After a failed tryout to become a WWF announcer and, who knows, maybe a wrestler as well, Garvin left the wrestling business entirely to train as a commercial pilot. Then in late 1993, Michael Hayes injured his back legitimately, yet for some reason he turned heel on Johnny B. Bad anyway, thereby requiring the two of them to have a match at Super Brawl 4 in late February. Anyway, for some random reason, Hayes, who was actually recovering from back surgery and genuinely couldn't wrestle until July of that year, was being pushed in a wheelchair by his old fabulous Freebird tag partner, Jimmy Garvin. It was not particularly explained why he was there all of a sudden, he just was. It also wasn't particularly well explained why Michael Hayes was still in WCW legalese, being signed to matches under the fabulous Freebirds name, according to new WCW Commissioner Nick Bockwinkel. Since Hayes couldn't wrestle, but the long-retired Garvin was apparently still a free bird even though he wasn't signed with WCW, that meant he was eligible to replace Michael Hayes in the match and had to get ready in 45 minutes, even though he didn't have any gear with him. Fast forward Super Brawl for an hour and Johnny B. Bad defeats the formerly jumping and now very much middle-aged and out of shape Jimmy Garvin. But then the sore loser Garvin threw Bad back into the ring and landed supposedly the first ever televised stunner on American television, thereby giving Mikey Whipwreck the idea to steal it, thereby giving Steve Austin the idea to steal it from Mikey, right? Wrong. The story goes that while Mikey was doing the whippersnapper in ECW, at the same time Steve Austin was part of ECW for those few months in late 1995, Austin did not actually directly rip off Mikey's finisher. It was actually Michael Hayes who suggested Jimmy Garvin's stunner to Steve Austin in the spring of 1996, thereby somehow bypassing Whipwreck's involvement in passing it down to Austin, voluntarily or otherwise. As an aside, Garvin left WCW immediately after his lone comeback match, and Michael Hayes also left WCW after Super Brawl 4 after being offered a reduced $75,000 per year deal. After working some indies, Hayes was picked up by the WWF as an announcer in early 1995. Also being picked up by Vince McMahon's World Wrestling Federation later in 95 was Steve Austin, deftly renamed the Ringmaster by the WWF Brain Trust. You see, because he was the master of the ring. Austin was immediately paired with Million Dollar Man Ted DiBiase as his manager, pretty much the kiss of death for any heel aside from Sid in the WWF at that time, as DiBiase just wasn't suited at being anything other than a wrestler, quite frankly, and that includes a commentator and a manager. DiBiase was a good promo in his day, but Austin, who had more than proven himself an excellent interviewer in ECW, was told to stay quiet and let Ted do the chit-chat. Austin was also told to use the $1 Million Dream as a finisher. Now this was more well known as Sergeant Slaughter's Cobra Clutch. It was basically a cross-arm choke cum sleeper thing. I'd put it on myself to show you, but I can't. Thrilling in 1983, less dynamic in 1996. Apparently Austin didn't want to use the stun gun from WCW either, so Michael Hayes suggested the sit-down jawbreaker on the shoulder rather than on the top of the head, as Jimmy Garvin had done back in WCW in 1994 as the first official stunner, so they say. But Jimmy Garvin did the first stunner on national television, not Michael Hayes. So, did Jimmy Garvin invent the stunner? No. Well, not according to Michael Hayes anyway. Michael Hayes claimed to have invented what he termed the 911. 911, the end of Johnny B. Bad. And then gave it to Jimmy as a new finisher of sorts for him to do at the WCW pay-per-view.
Plop down on your ass and drive your opponent's throat into your shoulder.
So, does that mean that Michael Hayes invented the stunner? No! He did indeed give Steve Austin the idea to use the stunner, and he did show Steve Austin how to do the move in Fayetteville, North Carolina at a WWF Raw taping. Hayes also claimed that he'd worked on developing the move while still in WCW, and it's basically accepted that Hayes gave Jimmy Garvin the move to use on Johnny B. Bad at Super Brawl 4. But Michael Hayes did not invent the move, because apparently, whether it was by design or whether it was just a jawbreaker or something that went awry, it was actually Ron Simmons who invented the stunner, or who at the very least was the first person we believe to have performed a stunner on American television or anywhere else in 1989. That's 5 full years before the Jimmy Garvin Super Brawl 4 match. Along with Hacksaw Butch Reed as a member of the deeply underrated mass tag team of Doom, Ron Simmons was wrestling the Steiner brothers on pay-per-view at the Halloween Havoc 1989 event. Scott had a hammerlock on Ron when he tagged out, and Rick came in to reapply said hammerlock. As a reversal, Ron Simmons dropped Rick Steiner with a picture-perfect stunner. Whether this was meant to just be a variation of a jawbreaker just to get out to the next move, or whether this was developed by Ron to be added to his repertoire of maneuvers, or whether this was just something he thought of on the fly, we don't actually know, and it's something I would love to ask Ron about if I ever get the chance to. It could have been even somewhat of a mistake, but some of the greatest moves ever have actually been born from mistakes, and wrestlers recognise the crowd reaction and just kind of go with it. See Jake Roberts' DDT and Drew McIntyre's Claymore Kick as 2 great examples. So there you have it. As best we know, Ron Simmons was the first person to hit the stunner as we know it today on broadcast television, and Rick Steiner was the first person to take it. If you know of an earlier example, please let me know in the comments of this very video. Please like, comment, subscribe, all that kind of thing, and we'll see you all for the next video.